I signed my name on the last page, slid the pen across the table, and let them believe they'd won. Somebody's phone buzzed against my thigh before the ink I spent 9 years on was even dry. It was the family group chat. Finally, dead weight is gone. Walton hadn't realized I was still in your name and was never supposed to be included. My name's Dana Whitfield. I'm 35 years old, and for 11 years I've been a healthcare compliance auditor, which is a boring way of saying I get paid to notice things people don't want noticed. For 9 of those years, I was married to Preston Calloway, whose family owned a chain of orthopedic surgical centers in the Charlotte area. Calloway Bone and Joint Group, the billboards, you must have seen them. Knees that smile, smiling shoulders. A tagline that encourages you to return to the life you love. I used to believe that tagline. I don't do that anymore. The conference room where I signed those papers was Walton's personal lawyer's office, a guy named Everett. He charged $400 an hour to watch other people cry. There were no tears that day. Not me. Preston sat across from me in a blue dress shirt. I'd bought him for his father's retirement gala 2 years ago, an event that never took place because Walton refused to retire. Preston's mom, Diane, sat beside him in a cream blazer, glasses pushed up into hair that took more to maintain than my car payment. There was a folder in front of her that she hadn't opened. She didn't have to read anything. She knew already what she wanted it to say. "We're offering full custody, no contest," Everett said, sliding the settlement pages toward me like he was dealing cards. "Preston keeps the Lake Norman house. You keep your car and half of the joint checking account. Given the children's ages, we feel the arrangement is more than reasonable." Half of the joint checking was $11,000. The Lake Norman house was worth $2,300,000. Diane finally spoke, and her voice had that particular warmth she used only when she was about to say something cruel. "You'll be able to find a lovely little rental somewhere, Dana. Something practical. You've always been so good with practical things." I looked at her for a long moment. Practical stuff. For 9 years, the details. 2 weeks later, Sylvia confirmed that the credentialing board had processed and accepted the declaration. She managed balancing the household budget, dealing with every insurance claim related to Milo's asthma inhalers, and silently absorbing every comment Sylvia made about my parents' modest house in Gastonia, which she had visited once and described as cozy, in a tone that made the word feel like a barb. "I know," I said. Yes. Preston didn't look at me. He hadn't really looked at me in over a year, not since Paige started working the front desk at the Ballantyne location, a 25-year-old with a laugh that carried down hallways and a habit of touching his arm when she handed him his coffee. 6 months ago, he'd moved her into one of the company's corporate condos, technically for relocation support, related to a promotion that never quite materialized into a real job title. I was aware of the condo. I knew about the coffee. I knew about many things, but Preston assumed I was too busy, too tired, or too practical to notice. "You're getting full custody of Ren and Milo," Preston said finally, still not meeting my eyes. "That's generous, Dana. Don't make the situation uglier than it needs to be." I picked up the pen. It was one of those thick, gold-plated deals law offices keep around, heavier than it looks, to make signing away your life feel ceremonial. I thought about the last 9 years in the space of about 4 seconds, which is a strange thing your mind can do when it needs to. I thought about Ren's 7th birthday, when Diane brought a professional photographer to a party at a bounce house and commented on how the balloon arch I had envisioned for Milo, who was 6 years old at the time, was not quite gallery quality. At that moment, Milo stood at the head of the dinner table, trying to tell his grandmother about a dinosaur he had learned about in school, stuttering over the word Tyrannosaurus. I thought about Milo, who was 6 years old, standing at the head of the dinner table and trying to tell his grandmother about a dinosaur he had learned about in school, stuttering over the word Tyrannosaurus, while Diane set down her wine glass and loudly suggested he might need a speech therapist before embarrassing himself at school. Milo hadn't finished the sentence. He never brought up dinosaurs at that table again. I thought about the credentialing renewal packet I'd found in Preston's home office 9 months earlier, a stack of federal paperwork required to keep the clinic's Medicare and Medicaid billing privileges active. My signature was on the attestation page for the compliance officer. I had never seen that document before the day I found it. I had never agreed to be listed as a compliance reviewer for Callaway Bone and Joint Group. But there it was, my name, in a signature that was close enough to mine to fool a notary who clearly hadn't looked very hard. I hadn't said anything about it that day. I'd photographed it with my phone and put it back exactly where I found it. I signed the divorce decree. Page 1, page 2, page 3. My signature was steady, unhurried, and completely real, which was more than I could say for the one sitting in a filing cabinet at Walton's downtown office. "Well," Diane said, closing the folder she'd never opened, apparently satisfied that the ceremony was complete. "I think that went about as smoothly as these things can." "It did," I agreed. I slid the settlement papers across the table. I took the pen and dropped it into my purse, a small petty theft that gave me an absurd flicker of satisfaction. I stood, smoothed my skirt, and walked toward the door. Nobody stopped me. Nobody said goodbye. Behind me, I heard Diane already talking about lunch reservations at the club, her voice light and bright, a woman relieved to be rid of an inconvenience. I made it to the elevator before my phone buzzed the first time. Family group chat, Walton Callaway. Finally, dead weight gone. Onward and upward for this family. 3 thumbs-up emojis followed, one from Diane, one from Preston, and one from Preston's sister Reagan, who ran a wellness supplement brand out of a converted sunroom and had blocked me on every platform except, apparently, the one where her father-in-law announced my elimination like a football score. Nobody had removed me from that chat. In 11 years of marriage into that family, nobody had ever once considered that I might actually read what they said when they thought I wasn't looking. It was, in a strange way, the most honest thing any of them had done for me in years. I didn't respond. I put the phone in my purse next to the stolen pen and rode the elevator down 11 floors in silence, watching the numbers fall, feeling something in my chest that wasn't grief and wasn't relief either. It was closer to the feeling you get when you finally set down something heavy you've been carrying, so long your arms have gone numb to the weight of it. Outside, the Charlotte air was thick with early September heat, the kind that makes the whole skyline shimmer slightly at the edges. I called my sister first, just to say it was done. Then I called the after-school program to confirm the pickup for Ren and Milo, because despite everything that had happened that morning, I still needed to check homework, prepare dinner, and refill a 6-year-old's inhaler before Thursday. I drove to the rental condo. I'd quietly signed a lease 3 weeks earlier, a 2-bedroom off South Boulevard that Preston didn't know existed yet, paid for out of a savings account he also didn't know existed, funded by a consulting side project I'd been running for 2 years under a name that wasn't mine. I let myself in, set my purse on the counter, and looked around at boxes I hadn't unpacked. It didn't feel like the beginning of a punishment. It felt like the first day of a life I'd been quietly building without anyone's permission. That evening, after Ren was asleep and Milo had finally drifted off clutching the stuffed triceratops he'd named Chomps, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and opened a folder I'd been adding to for the better part of a year. Screenshots, billing codes, a photograph of a signature that wasn't mine on a federal compliance document. Wire transfer records I didn't fully understand yet were tied to an account that funded Paige's condo, an account that didn't have Preston's name on it at all. I didn't know yet exactly what all of it meant. I only knew what 11 years as a compliance auditor had trained every instinct in me to recognize. Numbers don't lie, and neither do patterns, and I had just spent a year quietly documenting one hiding in plain sight inside a family that thought I was too busy being practical to ever really look. I closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and went to check on my children one more time before bed. Ren was sprawled sideways across her mattress, one arm hanging off the edge. Milo slept curled around Chomps, his breathing slow and even. They had no idea what was coming. Neither, for that matter, did the Callaways. I'd signed my name on the last page of that divorce decree and let them believe they'd won. What they didn't know was that I'd already read every file on that clinic's server twice, and I was about to read it a third time, slower, with a federal complaint form open in the next tab. I read the file a third time, slower, with a federal complaint form open in the next tab, and that is where the real work of that year had actually started. Not in the conference room, not in the group chat. Right there at my kitchen table, at 11 at night, with my son's nightlight glowing faintly down the hall and a folder full of numbers that didn't add up. I want to back up, because the divorce didn't begin the day I signed those papers. It began 14 months earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday, when I was helping Preston with what he called just organizing some files for the clinic's upcoming Medicare recertification. I wasn't an employee of Callaway Bone and Joint Group. I'd never wanted to be. However, I was married to the individual whose surname was displayed on the building, and each year during the recertification season, Preston would request that I review a stack of paperwork because, as he put it, "You are skilled at this task, and I consider it tedious." That Tuesday, I found a billing summary that made no sense. 62 documented arthroscopic knee procedures were billed to Medicare in a single quarter at one location, the Ballantine office, which had exactly one surgeon on staff and an operating schedule that, according to the same clinic's scheduling software, showed 19 procedures performed in that period. Not 62, 19. I didn't say anything to Preston that day. I told myself it was probably a coding error, a batch entry mistake, or something a compliance officer at the clinic would catch before it ever went anywhere. I filed it away in the part of my brain that notices things and waits. 2 weeks later, I found the second one, a procedure code for a full shoulder reconstruction, billed at just under $19,000, was attached to a patient file that, when I looked closer at the intake date, belonged to a woman who, according to her chart, had been seen for a follow-up on a sprained wrist. Wrong code, wrong body part, wrong dollar amount by a factor of 10. That's when I stopped telling myself it was an accident. I want to be clear about something, because I think people who haven't done this kind of work assume fraud looks dramatic, like something out of a movie, with men in suits shredding documents in the dead of night. It almost never looks like that. It looks like small, boring numbers, slightly wrong, over and over, in a pattern that only becomes visible if you're the kind of person trained to notice patterns instead of individual mistakes. I am exactly that kind of person. It is, unfortunately for the Callaway family, the entire reason Walton's attorney once joked at a Christmas party that they should hire me full-time. Over the following months, I built a folder. I didn't confront Preston. I didn't confront Walton. Initially, I told myself that I was just being cautious and wanted to understand the full picture before saying anything to anyone, because accusing a family like the Callaways of Medicare fraud without airtight documentation could end careers and marriages, and I was still trying to hold my marriage together, albeit poorly, for the sake of the kids. Somewhere in that same stretch of months, I noticed Preston had started staying late at the Ballantine office more often. He claimed it was administrative work, budget season, and the usual excuses that husbands make when a 25-year-old with a bright laugh is manning the front desk. I noticed the corporate condo lease that got signed under the clinic's business entity, technically for relocation support, tied to a regional coordinator promotion Paige never actually received. I noticed the Amex statement that showed weekly charges at a day spa in South Park, which occurred around lunchtime on days when Preston had told me he was in Raleigh for a conference. None of that shocked me the way the billing codes did. Grief has layers, and I was working through the page layer slowly, quietly, the way you work through anything you already suspect but haven't fully let yourself believe yet. The fraud was different. The fraud chilled my hands in a way that betrayal alone never could. By the time I signed the lease on the South Boulevard condo, 3 weeks before the divorce was finalized, I had 11 months of documentation prepared. Screenshots of scheduling software next to screenshots of billing submissions, bank statements, a photograph of my own forged signature on a federal attestation form, the one that had first cracked the whole thing open for me. I had enough, I believed, to eventually get somewhere. I just hadn't figured out yet exactly where, or when, or what it would cost me to do it. After signing the divorce papers, I sat at my kitchen table with Ren and Milo finally asleep, opened that folder again, and started organizing it as I would have for any client audit at my actual job. Dates, amounts, cross-references. I created a new document and began drafting what would eventually become a formal complaint, though at that point I still didn't fully understand who all the money was actually flowing to. That's when I found the wire transfers. I'd pulled the joint account statements weeks earlier as part of routine divorce paperwork, the kind any decent attorney tells you to gather before you sign anything. Buried in 3 months of statements from an account I didn't recognize, an account technically owned by an LLC called Lakeshore Property Solutions, were 4 wire transfers, each around $3,000, with memo lines reading, "Condo, monthly," sent to the same property management company that handled Page's building. I assumed, reasonably, that the account was simply another layer of Preston's affair, laundered through some LLC to keep it further from Diane's prying eyes, because if there was one thing Preston understood clearly, it was that his mother read bank statements the way other people read the newspaper. I pulled the LLC registration to confirm my suspicions, mostly out of habit, similar to the instinct that makes an auditor check a receipt twice, even when the math already appears correct. Lakeshore Property Solutions wasn't registered to Preston. It wasn't registered to Walton either. It was registered to Foster Whitcomb, Reagan's husband. The outside financial consultant the family brought in 3 years earlier to professionalize the clinic's books, the same easy, likable brother-in-law who had pulled me aside at Preston's father's 60th birthday party and quietly told me, refilling my wine glass without asking, that he thought the family was too hard on me, that he'd always believed I deserved better than how they treated me. I remembered feeling, at the time, genuinely grateful that at least one person in that family seemed to see me as a person and not as an inconvenience. I stared at the transfer log a long time. It wasn't Preston's name on the account. It was Foster's. And I didn't understand why yet. But I understood enough to know I couldn't sit on it any longer. A folder full of suspicion is one thing. A wire transfer with a real name attached to it is something else entirely. And once I had that name, sitting on the rest of it started to feel less like patience and more like complicity. The next morning, after I dropped Ren and Milo at school, I sat in my car in the parking lot and made a decision I'd been circling for months without letting myself land on it. I wasn't going to hire anyone connected to Charlotte's medical or legal circles. Not a friend of a friend. Not someone Walton's attorney might play golf with. I needed someone entirely outside that world. Someone with no reason to soften anything for the sake of a relationship they'd have to maintain after the case was over. I found her through a professional compliance network I'd belonged to for years, a healthcare regulatory attorney based out of Richmond named Sylvia Marsh, who specialized in exactly the kind of thing sitting in my folder. I called her office that afternoon. 2 days later, I was in a conference room in Richmond, 90 minutes from home, laying out a year of documentation on a stranger's table because I trusted a stranger with no stake in Charlotte's society far more than I trusted anyone who did. Sylvia went through it methodically, the way I would have gone through a client's records. She didn't gasp, she didn't act shocked. She made notes, asked precise questions, and about 40 minutes in, she looked up at me and said something I've thought about many times since. The forged signature isn't just a personal violation, Dana. It's the thread that unravels the rest of it. You're listed as a compliance reviewer on federal filings you never agreed to review. That means, legally, your name has been sitting on attestations tied to exactly the kind of billing irregularities you've documented here. You need to get your name off those filings before anything else happens. Today, if we can manage it. I hadn't fully processed until that moment that the forged signature wasn't just an old grievance, it was live exposure. My name, linked to federal filings and fraudulent billing, meant that whatever consequences awaited Callaway Bone and Joint Group could also potentially affect me unless I managed to extricate myself from the situation cleanly and officially. We filed a formal declaration of unauthorized signature that same week, submitted to the credentialing board that oversees Medicare and Medicaid provider attestations, along with a notarized statement from a handwriting comparison I'd had done independently and copies of the original document I'd photographed 9 months earlier next to an exemplar of my actual signature. It wasn't dramatic. It was 2 pages of dense legal language and a stack of exhibits. Sylvia told me it would take a few weeks to process through the board, quietly, without anyone at the clinic necessarily being notified right away, since it was framed as an internal record-keeping correction rather than an accusation. That same week, I found something else while going through the divorce financial disclosures that Sylvia insisted I request in full. The Lake Norman house, which Preston fought so diligently to keep in the settlement, was free and clear. However, it turned out to have a lien against it. Preston had fought so hard to keep the Lake Norman house in the settlement. I had always assumed that the Lake Norman house, which Preston fought so hard to keep in the settlement, was free and clear. However, it turned out that it was not. Preston fought so hard to keep in the settlement what was free and clear, but it wasn't. It was not free and clear as I had always assumed it would be. 3 years earlier, when Foster started working as the family's financial consultant, the Callaways had borrowed $1.8 million using a home equity line of credit on the Lake Norman house, arranged through a private lender who needed a personal guarantor with excellent income and credit, because Walton's business income from the clinic wasn't enough to meet the lender's requirements by itself. The guarantor on that HELOC was me. Not Preston, not Walton, me. My income from my compliance consulting work and my credit score built over a decade of paying every bill on time while managing a household the Callaways treated as beneath their notice, had been quietly used to prop up a line of credit against a house I was being handed $11,000 and a used Subaru in exchange for walking away from. I sat with that for a long moment in Sylvia's office. I thought about Diane's voice in that conference room, telling me I'd find a lovely, practical little rental somewhere. I thought about how thoroughly they had underestimated exactly how much of their lives had been quietly resting on mine. Once the credentialing declaration processes and your divorce are finalized, Sylvia said, watching me carefully, your name comes off the guarantor agreement as a matter of course, since the settlement severs joint financial responsibility. The lender will require re-underwriting the loan based solely on Walton's and Preston's incomes. Given what you've told me about the clinic's actual cash position, I'd be very surprised if it requalified. Meaning what happens to the house? This means that once your name is no longer associated with the house, it becomes the family's responsibility, not yours. I drove home from Richmond that evening with the windows cracked, cool air moving through the car, feeling something unfamiliar settle into my chest. It wasn't a victory, not yet. It was more like the quiet satisfaction of actually doing something, rather than just noticing things and waiting. For over a year, I had been a documented, silent witness to my life being used as collateral, in every sense of that word, by people who never once thought to ask my permission, because they assumed I would say yes. I picked up Ren and Milo from my sister's house, where they had stayed for the afternoon. Then, I made dinner, helped Milo with a worksheet about telling time, and put them to bed as I did every night, a routine I would continue regardless of what else was happening in conference rooms, credentialing boards, and lenders' underwriting departments across the state. That part of my life, the actual, ordinary part, never stopped while the rest of it quietly detonated in the background. I think that surprised me more than anything else that year, how completely unremarkable my evenings continued to feel while I was busy dismantling an empire one notarized document at a time. Sylvia called 2 weeks later to confirm the declaration had been processed and accepted by the credentialing board. My name was removed from all federal attestations tied to Callaway Bone and Joint Group, officially, permanently. The lender that administered the HELOC had been separately notified, as required, that the guarantor relationship was terminated effective the date of my final divorce decree, which was now only 11 days away. My attorney called it a declaration of unauthorized signature. I called it the first domino. I called your name. It was never supposed to be included in the first domino, and dominoes, once they start falling, have a way of making noise you can't control the timing of. Walton found out about the credentialing filing 9 days before it would have otherwise stayed quiet. And he found out because someone on the board's administrative staff, a woman he'd apparently played tennis with for years, made a courtesy call to warn him something had changed in the clinic's federal paperwork. My phone rang at 6:40 in the morning. I almost didn't answer it because I didn't recognize the number, but something made me pick up. Dana. Walton's voice was flat, controlled in the specific way men like him get controlled right before they stop being controlled at all. I need you to explain to me why my credentialing office is telling me your name has been pulled from federal filings without my knowledge. Because it was never supposed to be on them in the first place, Walton. That signature has been on file for 3 years. Nobody forced you to sign anything. Nobody asked me to sign anything either. I found it in Preston's office 9 months ago. I have the original document. I've had it authenticated. It's not my handwriting, and we both know it. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I could hear, faintly, Diane's voice in the background asking who was calling so early. Walton covered the phone for a moment, and when he came back, his tone had shifted from controlled anger into something closer to negotiation, which told me more than his anger had. "Let's not do anything hasty here," he said. "Whatever misunderstanding happened with that paperwork, we can sort it out privately, between family. There's no need to involve outside attorneys, outside boards, or any of that. It reflects poorly on everyone, Dana, including you." "I'm not family anymore, Walton. The papers were signed a week and a half ago." "You have children with my son. That makes you family whether you like the terminology or not." His voice hardened again. "I'll have my attorney reach out to yours. I'd strongly suggest you withdraw whatever you filed before the situation becomes complicated in ways you don't want. Before the situation becomes complicated in ways you don't want, I suggest you withdraw whatever you filed, in ways you don't want." He hung up before I could reply, which was a reply of sorts. Sylvia called that afternoon to tell me that Walton's attorney, Everett, had indeed reached out. Not with a legal argument, since there wasn't one to make against a legitimate forged signature declaration, but with what she diplomatically called pressure of a personal nature, threats to countersue for defamation. There were vague mentions of Preston reconsidering the custody arrangement if I insisted on making this ugly. Everett had actually used the word ugly twice in a 5-minute call, which Sylvia found almost funny considering what he presumably didn't yet know was coming. "They're scared," she said to me. "People only threaten custody when they have no real legal recourse to threaten you with. Ignore it. Document it. We'll keep going." Diane's escalation, which occurred 2 days later, felt simple to shrug off. One Wednesday evening, she showed up at the South Boulevard condo unannounced while I was helping Milo with his reading homework at the kitchen table. I heard the knock and foolishly assumed it was a delivery. Diane stood in the hallway in a coat far too formal for the weather, her purse clutched to her chest like a shield. "I've got to talk to you," she said, brushing past me into the entryway before I'd even invited her in. "Diane, this is not a good time. The kids." "This is about the children." She looked past me at the kitchen table, where Milo sat with his reading workbook, shoulders tensing as they always did whenever his grandmother's voice was in a room. Actually, it's mostly about Milo. I felt something cold settle in my gut. What about Milo? Preston's lawyer will be asking for a custody evaluation. Given the boy's speech impediments and, frankly, given the instability of uprooting 2 kids into some rental apartment in the middle of a contentious legal battle, we think it's only responsible to seek a professional evaluation. Kids need stability, Dana. Consistency. A stable, calm home environment. I'm not sure you are providing that by running around filing papers against your own family. I stopped quite still. I heard Milo's pencil stop behind me. "You are going to use his stutter," I said softly, "to show that I am an unfit parent." "I'm just saying that a qualified evaluator needs to look at the whole picture. We need to look at whether the emotional strain you are causing from all of your actions is contributing to his difficulties. It wouldn't be surprising if the emotional strain you are causing is contributing to his difficulties. I've spent a lot of my working life being calm in rooms where other people were losing their cool, because often being composed is all the leverage you have left. I called on all that training in my kitchen that night, with my son's pencil frozen on the page behind me, and his grandmother in my entryway, saying his stutter was proof of my failure as a mother. Not 4 years of her telling him he needed a speech therapist before he embarrassed himself. "Diane," I said, "I want you to leave now. If Preston's attorney wants to do a custody evaluation, he is welcome to do so. I have no concerns at all about any evaluator looking at the whole picture." No. There was something in my voice that must have carried more certainty than she expected, because she hesitated, recalculating. "There's no need to be dramatic about the situation." "I'm not being overdramatic. I'm asking you to get off my property, Dot." She left. I shut the door, turned the deadbolt, and stood there a moment with my hand on the lock before I returned to the kitchen table, where Milo was looking at me with the special wariness of a 6-year-old who has learned to read a room, even when he can't always get his words out of it in time. "Was that your grandma, Diane?" he asked Dot. "It was, baby. She's gone now." "Is she angry at us?" I sat beside him and put my arm around his shoulder. "No, baby. She is not mad at you. Not ever. Let's finish this page, all right? You're doing so well on this word." He read the remainder of the page slowly, stumbling over the word "together" twice, and I reminded him, as I always did, that there was no need to rush, that words emerged at their own pace, and that I was proud of him regardless of the circumstances. It was the only moment in that entire year that made me most sure I'd done the right thing in signing those papers. That night, after the kids were in bed, I called Sylvia and told her about Diane's visit. She was silent for a minute, then asked me a question I didn't see coming. "Dana, I think we need to talk about the whistleblower complaint." Weeks earlier, we had discussed the possibility of filing a whistleblower complaint, but only in abstract terms, similar to how people discuss decisions they are not yet ready to make. Filing a formal complaint with the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General under the False Claims Act, based on the year of documented upcoding and phantom billing I'd compiled, wasn't something that could be undone once it was submitted. It would trigger a federal investigation into Callaway Bone and Joint Group. It would very likely become public eventually. The specific provisions of the False Claims Act would legally entitle me to a percentage of whatever the government recovered if the investigation confirmed what I had documented. I remembered Diane standing in my doorway, suggesting my son's stutter made me unstable. I remembered Walton's phone call and his lawyer's vague threats, all of it designed to make me flinch and withdraw a legitimate legal filing, simply because they had more money and more lawyers and more decades of practice intimidating people into silence. "Let's put it on file," I said. 3 days later, we filed the complaint under seal, pursuant to the qui tam provisions of the False Claims Act, which meant it would remain confidential during the HHSOIG's initial review, invisible to the Callaways, even as it made its way through the federal system toward whatever it was going to become. About then, Reagan announced on the same family group chat I still hadn't been removed from that Paige was pregnant. Preston had proposed. There were photos of a ring and a bottle of sparkling cider, since Paige wasn't drinking, and Diane's caption called it, "The fresh start this family has been waiting for." 2 days later, another message appeared in the chat. Diane sent another message, this time saying that the whole family would be attending Paige's 20-week screening appointment at a private maternity clinic downtown, and she insisted on witnessing this genetic health screening in person, saying it was to confirm the health of the true heir before we finalize the trust. I read that message 3 times. I thought about the wire transfers from Foster's LLC to Paige's building. I thought about a year of numbers that never quite added up, and a family that had never once considered that the woman they dismissed as practical might also be quietly excellent at arithmetic. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, they would all be in the same room when the truth came due. I already knew what the report would say. I just didn't know who else in that family knew about the situation. I didn't know who else in that family knew what I knew. But by 9:15 the next morning, standing on the wrong side of a set of frosted glass doors at Cordell Women's Health downtown, I knew I was about to find out along with them. I hadn't planned to go. Sylvia had told me more than once that there was nothing for me to gain by being physically present for whatever happened at that appointment, that my job now was to let the paperwork I'd already filed do its work quietly, and stay far away from anything that could be construed as harassment. I agreed with her. And then Wren's school called that morning to say she'd forgotten her inhaler backup, and the fastest route to drop it off happened to take me directly past the clinic's parking garage, at exactly the moment when Walton's black Suburban pulled in ahead of me. I told myself that was a coincidence. I parked 2 rows over anyway, and I stayed. I saw them come through the tall windows of the waiting area on the ground floor of the clinic, like you watch a parade you weren't invited to. Walton went first, in a woolen overcoat far too heavy for the weather, with a particular swagger of a man who believes every room is there to be impressed by him. Diane was behind him, clutching a leather portfolio to her chest, like a trophy she hadn't yet been handed. Preston held the door for Paige, whose hand rested on a visibly rounded stomach under a soft gray dress. Reagan was bringing up the rear, her phone already raised as she narrated the moment for whatever audience still followed her wellness account. And last, Foster moved with the quiet, unhurried calm that he always carried. I stared at Foster's face longer than I meant to. He didn't look nervous. He looked like a man at a meeting whose outcome he had already decided, which, as I would learn within the hour, was precisely the opposite of what he actually believed. I didn't go in. I sat in my car, Wren's inhaler on the passenger seat, telling myself I'd leave the minute I dropped it off, and instead found myself watching the elevator numbers through the glass, heading toward the private suites on the 4th floor, where Cordell kept its VIP consultation rooms for just the sort of families who paid extra to avoid a public waiting room. I have to be honest about something. I didn't orchestrate what happened in that fourth-floor suite. I couldn't have, even if I'd wanted to. What happened there was entirely the product of a year of decisions, none of them made carefully, coming all at once in front of each other with nowhere left to hide from it. I learned the details later, partly from Preston's own furious voicemails over the next few days, and partly from Reagan, who called me sobbing 3 weeks later, needing someone, anyone, willing to listen. Putting it all together, the truth is, what happened in that room, The appointment started the way these appointments always do. A nurse took Paige's blood pressure, an ultrasound technician did the standard anatomy scan, confirming healthy development, a strong heartbeat, and all the numbers a family desperate for good news wants to hear. Diane, Reagan says, had the trust fund documents out on the small side table before the technician had even left the room, ready to have Walton sign the moment the doctor confirmed everything was in order. Then Dr. Okafor, the maternal fetal specialist supervising the pregnancy, walked in carrying a much thicker folder than the ultrasound printouts, and her demeanor, Reagan told me, had shifted from the pleasant efficiency of a routine checkup to something more careful. "We did the expanded carrier screening panel that your family requested," Dr. Okafor said, according to Reagan, "which tests for a wider range of recessive genetic markers than the standard panel. I want to take you through what we found because it does merit some more discussion." Diane, it seemed, waved a hand impatiently. "Is the baby healthy? That's about all we need to know before we sign the paperwork." "The baby's anatomy and growth are excellent," said Dr. Okafor. "But the panel flagged something in the fetal DNA that doesn't match the parental samples we have on file. In particular, we found genetic markers compatible with a rare recessive metabolic disease. Both biological parents must carry at least one copy of the gene to pass these markers to a child. We screened Preston's sample on the standard paternal panel in the screening protocol, and the allele patterns are all wrong." To be perfectly honest, a small, unguarded part of her had hoped for one more second that the situation was a horrible misunderstanding. But instead, her husband closed his eyes and said, "A kind of mismatch usually indicates a paternity discrepancy, not a lab error. We've already rerun the sample twice to rule that out." Reagan told me the room went completely silent. Walton set down his coffee cup so hard it cracked the saucer. "What exactly do you mean?" Reagan said, Preston said, his voice already climbing toward something sharp and frightened. "I'm saying," said Dr. Okafor slowly, "that by the genetic data I have before me, it is medically impossible for you to be the biological father of this baby. Paige." Reagan started crying almost immediately. Not the tears of shock, so much as the tears of someone who'd been quietly dreading this exact moment for months and had simply run out of road to keep dreading it privately. She didn't deny it. She didn't blame a lab error. She sat very still on the exam table and said, in a small voice, that it had happened once, that she'd never meant for it to become anything, that she didn't know how to mention it once she realized the timeline didn't work for Preston. "Who?" Preston said. Reagan said Paige kept repeating just that one word, "Who?" over and over again. "Who? Who? Who?" Paige didn't speak. Reagan said she saw Paige's eyes move, involuntarily, helplessly, around the room to where Foster was standing by the window, and that everyone in the room followed her gaze at the same time. The way a crowd turns toward a sudden noise before they've even registered what made it. Neither did Foster deny it. Reagan said that the worst part was that a small, unguarded part of her had hoped for one more second that the situation was a horrible misunderstanding, but instead, her husband simply closed his eyes and quietly said, "Reagan, I can explain." "You can't explain such a situation in a room like that." Reagan told me she doesn't remember standing up, only that she was suddenly across the room with her hand raised and that Walton had to physically pull her back before she made contact. Diane, apparently, kept repeating the word impossible over and over, staring at the cracked coffee saucer as though it were the only stable object left in the room. Walton demanded the doctor rerun the test a third time, then demanded to know why the clinic hadn't caught the issue earlier. Then, when Dr. Okafor calmly explained the panel had only been requested at this specific 20-week appointment per the family's own instructions, he simply stood there with his mouth working soundlessly, a man who had never once in his adult life encountered a problem he couldn't threaten his way out of. It was Preston, Reagan said, who finally broke the silence in a manner none of them expected. Not with rage, with a small, strange, humorless laugh. "She knew," he said. Reagan asked him who. "Dana. She must have known. On the fraud. All of it. She sat in that room and signed the papers and made us think we had won." No one knew the answer to that either, mainly because no one in that room yet understood how much of what was quietly detonating around them, beyond Foster and Page, had absolutely nothing to do with genetics at all. The room was still in a shambles when Foster's phone rang, Reagan said, and he moved to the window to take it, his face going pale in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with the paternity reveal. He didn't say much. He listened, said the word "understood" once, flatly, and hung up. When Walton asked what the call was about, Foster said, in a voice Reagan described as hollowed out, that it was the bank, regarding the HELOC on the Lake Norman property. The guarantor relationship had been formally severed that morning with a finalized divorce decree, and the loan was going out for re-underwriting immediately. Walton didn't understand the meaning of that yet. Reagan said he actually said, "What does that have to do with anything right now?" Which tells you everything about how little attention he'd ever paid to the fine print of his family's finances. Nobody in that room was thinking about the clinic bill sitting unpaid downstairs from the ultrasound. Nobody was thinking about a federal complaint sealed under review at HHSOIG, or a credentialing filing quietly stripped a week and a half earlier, or a mortgage suddenly resting on income that had never, on its own, qualified for it. They didn't know both were already due. They didn't know both were due, but by the time I picked Ren up from school that afternoon, dropped off the forgotten inhaler, and drove home without ever going inside that clinic, the first calls had started. I want to be careful explaining this part because it happened very fast, in the disorienting way that real collapses often do not have one dramatic scene, but a series of small events happening one after another, making it challenging for those experiencing it to tell which piece of negative news was causing which consequence. The HELOC re-underwriting Foster referenced in that consultation room was not a rubber stamp. The lender required Walton's and Preston's combined income and credit to independently support the $1.8 million in equity debt against the Lake Norman house, as my name had been removed as the guarantor. Walton's income, on paper, looked substantial, built almost entirely off distributions from Callaway Bone and Joint Group's revenues. Only that same week, the sealed HHSOIG complaint I'd filed a month earlier stopped being sealed. Qui tam complaints under the False Claims Act are confidential during an initial period of investigation by the government. But once the HHSOIG completes its preliminary review and opens an investigation, the defendant, in this case Callaway Bone and Joint Group, is notified, and the clinic's banking relationships are identified as routine federal compliance procedures. The lender that handled the HELOC received that notice 9 days after the appointment at Cordell. A commercial loan under active federal fraud investigation does not re-underwrite favorably. The line of credit was called in full. The borrower has 30 days to pay $1.8 million, or the house will go into foreclosure. They didn't have it. I learned later, through channels I'll get to, that Walton's actual liquidity, once you stripped away the appearance of wealth built on borrowed equity and clinic revenue that had been artificially inflated by a year of phantom billing, was nowhere near what 30 days would require. The house went into foreclosure proceedings before Thanksgiving. Once formally initiated, the HHSOIG investigation moved at a speed that surprised even Sylvia. Federal auditors had frozen the clinic's primary operating accounts pending review within 6 weeks, a standard precaution in active fraud cases. Callaway Bone and Joint Group could not make payroll for its staff, pay its malpractice insurance premiums, and effectively function as a business while the investigation proceeded. Walton was indicted the following spring on multiple counts of healthcare fraud and false claims, based substantially, though not entirely, on the documentation I'd quietly been compiling at my kitchen table for a year. Preston wasn't named in the first indictment. He hadn't personally submitted the billing codes, but the investigation eventually implicated him in a secondary role for knowingly signing off on revenue reports he had every reason to question but chose to approve. He lost his position at the clinic when its accounts were frozen, which meant he lost his income at almost exactly the same time his father lost the house. His fiancée's pregnancy became a public scandal, and his marriage to me had already been over for 2 months. I understand, secondhand, that he moved into a rental unit not far from where I'd once imagined myself ending up, the kind of practical apartment Diane had once suggested for me, with a small, satisfied smile. In the weeks that followed, Reagan told me that Diane kept insisting on this matter. What Reagan told me in the weeks that followed was to insist, repeatedly, that this was all some misunderstanding that would resolve itself once the right people were spoken to. She continued to attend her country club luncheons for a few weeks after the news became local gossip, until it became clear the other women there had stopped returning her calls to confirm reservations. I don't know where she's living now. I stopped asking Reagan for updates after a certain point, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely no longer needed to know. Paige left before the baby was born. Reagan told me she moved out of the corporate condo, which by then was no longer being paid for by anyone, and disappeared from the family's orbit entirely, presumably heading off to whatever her next chapter looked like, wherever that was. I don't know if Foster ever went with her. I know Reagan filed for divorce within the month, and that she called me 3 weeks after the appointment at Cordell, sobbing, asking if I'd known, if I'd somehow orchestrated the timing of everything to detonate on the same day. I told her the truth. I hadn't engineered the timing of the paternity reveal at all. That part was entirely Paige's and Foster's own choices, arriving on its schedule with no help from me at all. The financial collapse, the credentialing withdrawal, the HELOC, the federal complaint, those were mine, built carefully over a year, filed through proper legal channels, entirely truthful, and completely earned. The two things just happened to land in the same week, which I understand looks, from the outside, like something engineered. It wasn't. It was just what happens when a family builds its entire foundation on other people's labor and honesty, and then all of those people, independently, stop covering for them at the same time. I didn't say any of that to be cold to Reagan. I actually felt for her, genuinely, more than anyone else in that family. She'd built her entire public identity on a marriage that was as hollow as everything else around her. And she hadn't been the one running the fraud, or forging my signature, or threatening my son's stability to score a point in a custody fight. I told her I hoped she found her footing. I meant it. I also told her that I couldn't keep being the person she called at midnight to process her family's collapse, because I had 2 children of my own who needed me to be steady. And I'd spent enough years being the quiet, practical person everyone in that family called when they needed something managed. That chapter of my life was over. Preston Quote's voicemails trickled in for a couple of months. At first he was annoyed, telling me I knew better, that I had allowed him to walk into that appointment, that I owed him an explanation. Then slowly the messages got quieter, asking about Ren and Milo, and whether I would consider mediation on visitation now that his schedule was, in his words, more flexible than expected. I answered the ones about the kids. I didn't answer the others. There is a particular freedom and understanding that you no longer owe anyone an explanation for the choices you made in good faith, through legal means, with your own documented work and your name. 4 months after signing those divorce papers, I left the family group chat on a quiet Tuesday evening. The same chat Walton had once used to announce that dead weight was finally gone. I didn't leave a dramatic message. I typed one line. I wish you all the clarity that comes with an honest accounting. Then I left, blocked every number attached to it, and didn't look back. By then, Ren and Milo and I had settled into a rhythm in a new city, a few hours from Charlotte, close enough that the kids could continue to see their father, according to a supervised visitation schedule, far enough that Diane's unannounced visits and country club pronouncements had no way of reaching our kitchen table anymore. I had positioned myself with a regional compliance firm that specifically recruited from healthcare fraud cases, which felt, in a small, quiet way, like the universe handing me a job description built entirely out of my own worst year. Milo quote stutter, I know, eased slowly over the months after that, like it often does for kids when the pressure around them lifts. He still catches on to certain words sometimes, especially when he's excited, and I have never once treated it as something to correct, but rather something to simply allow him room for. Last month he told me an elaborate, mostly true story about a substitute teacher and a broken pencil sharpener, stuttering twice through the word sharpener and laughing through it, instead of freezing the way he used to at that old dinner table. And I sat there afterward for a long moment, just feeling something in my chest finally settle all the way down. Sometimes I think back to that year, the one where I sat quietly writing down numbers at my kitchen table, while a whole family assumed my silence meant I'd already lost. I did not confront them in the manner I was expected to, through shouting, public disputes, and dramatic gestures during Thanksgiving dinner. I fought them the way I knew how to fight, with documentation, with patience, with the exact unglamorous power of simply telling the truth to the right institutions in the right order and then getting out of the way. I didn't destroy them. I simply ceased to hold up their ceiling. Everything else they did themselves. So, if you were me, sitting across that table the day they offered you a settlement and called it generous, I want to know honestly what you would have done. Would you have fought loud, right there in that conference room? Or would you have taken the quiet road, the slow one, the one that requires a year and a folder full of receipts? Please share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story resonates with you, return for the next one. I'm the long memory, and there's always another ledger waiting to close.